Looking a little bit further out, what does explainability need to do? What does it need to accomplish to basically future-proof a lot of the systems that are going into play, recognizing that there'll be a lot more scrutiny of the black box problem that Gen AI obviously presents us with?
Yeah, Colin, thanks for the very difficult question there.
Always.
It is. I think because generative AI obviously brings with it heightened risks and new risks. The models are hugely complex. They're intractable. They don't submit to any kind of explainability type technique that we're used to. Things like Shapley and line values and so on, which were kind of suitable for gradient descent. I'm not aware of anything that's really usable in the same way. Now, for generative AI, there's a lot of focus on grounding. So, so the ability to surface the right context that accompanies the prompt into the model, and then to ensure that the answer that comes back actually answers the question and is grounded in the context. That seems to be the main thrust at the moment of ensuring that answers from generative AI are safe, are reliable, relevant, and so on and so forth. So there are some metrics that are being developed, and some of the big cloud providers have those as part of their guardrails. And there are fintech companies that are developing technology around that. So that seems to be some of the emerging techniques being used on certainly on generative rather than the predictive AI. And yes, and all organizations, certainly that I talk to, have those as a core part of their infrastructure, right? So the ability to put those guardrails right at the front of their LLM gateway to ensure that everything is logged, and there are filters there as well. There are whitelists. There are small technologies that are being added and augmented to large language models in Gen AI. But from my perspective, the main thing is you can't go into the model and fix the model. You kind of have to put stuff around the model to ensure that, nothing harmful goes in, and certainly nothing harmful comes out. And then to try and make sure explainability is provided through some tooling rather than from within the model. And that's had a big effect, right? That has a big effect on things like model risk governance, model validation. Because in the old days with model validation, we had our own training data. We could debias the training data. We could put in processing techniques like regularization in the model. So there were techniques to support explainability because we had access to the model and the training data, and it was kind of tractable, right? Generative AI, none of those. We don't have any of those luxuries, so we have to resort to some other mechanism. And the ones I mentioned seem to be some of the emerging mechanisms that we have. I think with respect to future proofing, and I think Colin, you mentioned that, and Raquel, you did as well. I think active engagement with regulators is really important, right? So how do we future proof ourselves? Well, the technology is changing really quickly. The regulators are responding, but I think it's really healthy for banks to have an open, frank conversation with regulators about what's happening within banks and how they see technology developing. I think, and Raquel, you touched on it, horizon scanning, super important. So my responsible AI team work hand in hand with Reg Affairs and our horizon scanning teams. And I think the last thing I'd like to mention in terms of future proofing is having a governance, risk, and compliance system in place that's really tailored towards managing AI risks. And the big change we see there is, rather than model validation, historically model validation was what validation teams and risk teams looked at. And now we're talking about validating systems. And if you go to the EU AI Act, they're really clear about this. An AI system is comprised of many component parts, not just the model itself. So there's everything around training data, other components that go around it, validation routines, and so on and so forth, and some of the guardrails I mentioned. So assuring a system that's comprised of all of those parts is a much bigger exercise. And I'm really glad to see that there are technology platforms now being built, some by new organizations, some being provided by big tech companies that are really looking at assurance of systems rather than just the model behind the system.